for our cash tag segment. Good morning and happy Friday to you, Megan. Thanks for joining us. We wanted to zoom out here, take a break from the earnings talk, and talk a little bit of macro, because everywhere you look, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on headlines, whether it's on the TV, everything seems to be still about COVID in the news headlines. But I wanted to look and see, is that still the talk of the town? Is that still what we're seeing on social media? Is there still this fear around it?
So we track these mentions in a couple of different ways. And I think the first way we'll approach it is how consumers are talking about the coronavirus or COVID. So we're listening for these mentions just in general. And across the board, we're seeing them really start to, settle in. It's still holding relatively, well, actually not relatively, much lower than the levels that we were recording in March. We are seeing a little bit of an uptick into July. I think whenever, you look at this chart, you can see mentions start to go up a little bit in July, but still comparatively down from the March highs that we recorded.
Now, Megan, there's a lot of discussion, as there's always going to be, about the coronavirus and the hot spots and the cold spots and the numbers getting bigger, numbers getting smaller. But isn't it true that until we get a vaccine, we're living with this? So there's going to be spots where things pop up along the way. And what we really need to see a significant drop off in this is really a vaccine or some type of treatment for this. And, your numbers that I see here are pretty consistent. After the big spike in mid-March, they've settled into a range that, is going up and down, but still staying pretty consistent. Am I wrong there? Or tell me what I'm doing right and wrong there.
No, you're exactly right. I think that there is this level of normalcy as consumers are now living their lives as normal as they can. And so we're kind of watching to see, okay, what is this picture of new normal like? We've talked about people who are taking road trips closer to home. We've talked about how important digital is. I think that you're seeing this in a lot of companies that are reporting, just look at Chipotle, where now digital makes up 60% of their sales. So I think that we're trying to watch now from our perspective, what companies are executing well in this new normal and what companies are well positioned for future growth even beyond this as consumers kind of shift their behavior in a permanent fashion.
Megan, before we dive into the fear index, which I know is another interesting indicator that you guys are tracking, on this coronavirus mentions chart that we're looking at, this looks a lot like kind of the charts that were shown to us about what we were shooting for with the overall virus, this flattening of the curve. It wasn't going to go away, but we're just trying to slow kind of the spread. And that's a lot what it looks like on the chart here. I know it's completely different, but to me, this kind of shows that, yeah, we've seen upticks. We know there's areas of the country that are getting hit hard right now, but it has largely just kind of been a consistent issue for really since it became an issue. And obviously the spikes initially, but kind of that, just because it maybe faded out and the story was getting a little bit better maybe in May and June, it was never really gone. It was just, it became less talked about for a little bit, and then it kind of had that resurgence. But this largely tells me that, at least people on social media have been talking about this and feeling about it basically this entire time.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to ignore when you look at the volume on that trend. This is some of the highest volume for a trend perspective that we record. So it's definitely, it's on consumers' minds. However, it's settled in. The levels that we're recording are much lower. I think as consumers, this is just part of everyday life now. This is just part of going to the grocery store, having things delivered, or whether you make your trip a little bit closer to home. People are they're adjusting and they're continuing to move on. And so we're just trying to watch where are they adjusting and where are companies well positioned to capitalize on this, or where are they positioned that they're really going to hurt from this.
And Megan, we also had the fear index that we want to take a look at as well. With the LikeFolio fear index, as you've seen volatility start to, kind of come into the market a little bit in some of these big mega cap names that have outperformed. We know that they're very popular amongst, a wide variety of investors, from professional investors to new young retail investors to all in between. Has that led to an uptick at all in the LikeFolio fear index, or does it look a lot like the VIX, which, had its spikes and has largely settled into much lower levels.
I think that our fear index, so this is actually mentions of investors. So normally whenever we're listening for mentions, we want to know what the consumer is saying. And so this index is actually isolating those investor mentions of people who maybe are a little bit fearful. And I think it is closely related to the VIX. It is a really good measure of volatility. And you can see that there was a spike in March, but we've since, we've settled in. And while things are still elevated, while these mentions are still elevated as investors are trying to understand how to navigate, especially in this upcoming week, all of the earnings that are about to come out, it's still relatively lower. There's not the level of fear that we recorded in March.
Kevin, I think that makes sense because when you think about this stuff, we haven't had the same volatility that we had in March. And now that that's happened, even if it were to happen kind of again, it isn't as big of a surprise the second time around. I might catch some off guard, but, it would almost be, hey, once something has happened, it can't necessarily completely surprise you the second time, right?
Exactly. And let's put some some discussion on this. Remember, when that Megan's coronavirus mentions chart, when that was spiking in mid to late March, that was when the overall market was also spiking downward in terms of volatility. And that was because why? Because the expectations that we were being given by officials was for 2.2 million deaths. And now we're somewhere between 140 and 150,000 deaths, and we're getting close to a vaccine for this. So things just never came to fruition like the risk and excitement of mid-March. So now we're, like you guys just said, and Megan points out, we're settled in at some levels where we're living with this coronavirus day by day. And what's going to change this graph to a lower number? Probably a vaccine, guys.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And Megan, you talked a lot about how when you're looking at these coronavirus, mentions, obviously that's the wide variety of just how many people are talking about it, but you're also kind of diving into it and you're trying to see, how are consumers thinking about this and how much of that right now is kind of front and center when you're looking at individual companies and you're thinking about, how is this set up for this quarter and what investments may look like a positive investment or one that maybe, hey, this doesn't seem to be adding up to how this stock's performing. How much is the macro picture being factored in now versus, maybe how it has been in the past?
I think that the macro picture now is more important than ever. We're looking at, I think this next week, we have over 60 companies that we cover that are consumer facing that are about to report earnings. And so we're specifically diving in to say, okay, who has a strong digital presence? Can we dive in and isolate those mentions? Do we think that this company is executing well? Who is just well positioned in general from the shift of different trends? So for example, permanently working from home, are there any companies that provide technology or provide products that can facilitate this permanent shift? And so I think it's just important at this time to understand that this next earnings report, these are really special circumstances. And so it's important to dive in and isolate, okay, what's different and how has the company adapted in this environment?
Well said. And Kevin, is that what the investor at home should do, just to simplify this a little bit, is just start thinking about different companies and putting them in a bucket? This is an e-commerce store. This is one that's primarily brick and mortar. Is that the best way to do things right now, to kind of parse things out and put them in their different, I guess, sector and subsector?
Yes. I mean, let's just take a stock like Microsoft, right? And everything that they offer with their teams and their, all the package and Azure and everything that Microsoft has to offer. That stock, though, has sold off pretty significantly from its earnings level. So how do you look at something like that? You have to make decisions on it. I think the easiest way to do it, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, is to go winners and losers, right? And then if you look at that winners bucket and say, like a perfect example of us looking at this week was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola clearly in the losers bucket since the coronavirus happened, but it went up. Why? Because their future is still good and they guide it as the future getting better. So there's opportunities on names that have been beat up, right? That have a chance to return to their old ways. And then there's the opportunities in companies that are, the economy has moved towards them and away from others. Like, I mean, the biggest story today, guys, is Intel versus AMD. And one has that 7-nanometer chip and one doesn't. And you can look at what's happening in both those stocks. It's amazing. But yeah, pay attention. There's a lot of decision making out there, guys.
No, definitely. And Megan, before we let you go and wish you a great weekend here, what's the name to watch, or is there a couple next week that is kind of, right in the middle of what you guys are most focused on?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of what's coming up next week. I think, is there a Pinterest or a Roku next week? Am I correct? I know one of those names is coming into play. And so, it's one thing that we're looking at specifically are different, social media and how advertising impacts that and how people are utilizing these different streaming devices and, watching entertainment from home. And there's a lot on the docket. So I think that it's important, like Kevin said, you got to take the winners and the losers, and you have to understand, does the market expect this to be a winner, or is the market expecting this to be a loser, and find the opportunities where maybe there's a surprise that most people aren't anticipating that you can take advantage of because you're thinking about these underlying trends at play.